Hi, and welcome to Music City listeners. I'm your host, Dewey Boyd, and I wanted to know how people find their place in the music industry. So, I've started asking the best listeners I can find how they did it, or maybe how it happened to them. Join me, won't you? We'll start with a simple, where are you from? And we'll see where this all goes. Well, guys, welcome. Thanks so much for coming over here to 4115, i.e. the address of this location. That's also the name of the studio because, creativity. So I'm excited to have here with us tonight Shane Wilson, who is surely the reason you're here and not to hear me talk about stuff or to see the studio.
Kooky talk.
Huh?
That's kooky talk.
That's kooky talk? I thought you said something about cookies. I was like, no, Natalie opted for brownies and not cookies. But yeah, so what the plan is, which there doesn't really have to be a whole lot of a plan because, we're just, actually, I think it's entirely, we're a bunch of dudes hanging out in a room together talking about music and audio. The idea is that a lot of times as engineers, you get to, you see a lot and you hear a lot. And one thing I learned early on, at the beginning of my time in Nashville, Shane was gracious enough to let me watch what he was doing for a bit. And I learned a whole lot that really the point is to listen. And so that's kind of what we're here to do tonight is Shane's been listening for a long time and want to hear about that. So for the first half of the time, I'm just going to ask Shane some questions that hopefully take care of some of the softball things you might be curious about. And then if you guys are squirming in your seats and or are hungry or thirsty, we'll take a little break and then we'll come back and you guys can ask Shane questions of things that you're curious about. So sound good? Okay, great. So where are you from? I don't even know if I know this.
Do you know? I'm
somewhere in Indiana, right?
Yeah, East Central Indiana. Literally, high school was in the middle of cornfields. It's a little town called Richmond that if any of you have been touring musicians, if you've driven east on Highway 70 out of Indianapolis, it's the last city in Indiana before Ohio. And by city, it's a little bit of a gross overstatement, but it's the last fly spot before Ohio on Interstate 70.
Nice. How did you, being in a town like that, how did you kind of get working in music or kind of fall in music or fall in the technology side?
It was probably falling into the technology. I mean, it was definitely falling into the technology side. I went to a tiny little church in the neighboring county, too tiny to actually have any kind of audio program, but they did. Mm-hmm. There was a computer science major out of Muncie, Indiana, who put together the audio program there, and he just noticed, I think I was 11 or 12, but he noticed I was always kind of poking around and asking questions and looking in the door, and eventually he was like, "You want to learn how to do this?" And I said yes, and so I did. And as usually goes with backwoods churches, there was a church split later, and we left there. But it kind of stuck with me as I got into music as a teen, as a consumer. It occurred to me one day that somebody who wasn't, I realized that I didn't necessarily have natural musical ability as a player or a performer, but I was drawn to music. It occurred to me that somebody must do that. Somebody must make those records, and started looking at credits and at some point in my high school career, discovered that Indiana University had an audio program, and my dad's factory offered a scholarship to kids, and I won one of those and went to IU to study audio. The program was small enough that you didn't just declare an audio major. You had to take the first semester of classes and then apply to the program. They never, back then, they didn't allow more than 12 students in a year. So, you kind of were just shooting in the dark for that first semester, taking all the classes and waiting for that letter over Christmas break, because it was pre-internet, so it wasn't email or anything like that, and waiting to see if I actually had a major to go back to, and I did, and it was an associate's degree, So it was 5 semesters on campus and then 1 semester of internship to get the degree. So
Did you intern closer there, or did you come down here?
That's how I ended up here.
Really?
Yeah. So I did my
Okay.
5 semesters, and then January 1st of 1991 moved to Nashville and started. I'd have to look at a calendar to see how the dates fall, but either January 2nd or January 3rd at a studio on Music Row that, of all the buildings to still be there, they've torn everything down. But there's that weird 9-story like hexagon building on 17th Avenue.
Yeah.
That used to be called the UA Tower before I was even there. Universal owned that building, and so it was historically called the UA Tower. And when I moved to town, there were multiple studios in that building that weren't Universal connected, but there were almost every other floor had a functioning studio of one kind or another. So on the 8th floor was a studio called Hummingbird, and I interned there for 3 months.
Nice.
Yeah.
Who's the engineer? Or was it kind of a rotating staff?
Actually, it was owned by a small record company at that point. It was called Hummingbird. It was really confusing, and we would get calls all the time. It was built by Hummingbird Productions. Are any of you guys familiar with the 3DB audio or 3D audio forum? Lynn Fuston?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Lynn Fuston, who started that and now works up at Sweetwater, was the designer of the original Hummingbird Studios, where I interned later. But it was built for a jingle company called Hummingbird Productions. And they ended up buying another building before I had moved here, an old house that got torn down for the Virgin Hotel that hasn't been built yet on 17th. One of the buildings that got torn down there was another studio, but they were still called Hummingbird Productions, but we were called Hummingbird Studios, and it was really confusing and weird. So while I was there, the record company had an intercompany contest to rename the studio, and it got renamed. I mean, they didn't ask the interns to weigh in, because if they had, I would have been like, what the hell? The name that won was Skylab, because it was up on the 8th floor. It's like, wait, you're naming it after a satellite that fell from the sky and people were worried was going to kill them? And that's what it was called until it closed. But Skylab was like, do you guys know the story of Skylab? Because there are chunks of it at the NASA Museum that people were afraid were going to land on their house. Anyway. So the building is still there, and it's all stripped back to the concrete pillars, but I can't believe that building's still there, and everything else that was actually cool has been torn down. But
Oh my gosh.
such is the way of progress.
I was actually just like right next door to that yesterday. I was doing a video shoot in the Curb Studios.
Oh, yeah,
right there.
yeah.
Anyway, that's bizarre. So bizarre. I wouldn't know what you were talking about if I had just been
Well,
there.
I mean, eventually, by the time, a country producer by the name of James Stroud. Is anybody familiar with him? Wow, I am fucking old. James Stroud was a session drummer long before I moved here, and then he became a huge country producer. But he and another producer by the name of Richard Landis, who was from LA, they had a studio on the ground floor called Loud. Landis, Stroud, Loud. So the ground floor was their studio for a while until they moved into what had been Masterphonics on the corner of 16th and whatever soundstage, whatever street that is. Loud moved over there eventually. But, so that was on the ground floor. There was a demo studio on the 9th floor. There was a radio station on the 9th floor.
How was the isolation between floors? That sounds like a...
I mean, it's thick concrete. Like, it's one of those buildings that was built from concrete. So everything about it is concrete. Which is why it's stripped back to the concrete, because a few years ago there was a huge fire that burned most everything except for the concrete. So, yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I had no idea. So you came down and you interned for 3 months. Mm-hmm. Then what happened?
I met an engineer. The studio was kind of small, so it was a control room, a machine room, and then it wasn't even a large, but one room for the tracking space. There wasn't even a booth in there. We would use the tiny little lounge that had the coffee machine and whatever as like additional space if we needed it. So it wasn't a big space. So back then, this was a year and a half before ADATs. You guys know what those are? Cool, I'm not that old. Awesome. But before true home recording technology kind of exploded, this was right before that. So the room would often be used just for overdubs. There wasn't a lot of full tracking going on just because there wasn't isolation. So back then people would pay, $400 a day to do vocals or guitar overdubs or, well, those are the days,
Those
right?
are the days. And that was in 1990s dollars too.
1991, yeah. But 400-ish or whatever for a room to do overdubs because nobody was doing it at home yet.
Right.
So because of that, I had the benefit of learning a room as well as I could. It was a Trident TSM console, which in my opinion is shit, but lots of ICs in that console, lots, really noisy, always broken console, but that's what they had. Studer A827 2-inch 24-track machine. So I got to learn that equipment really well, really limited amount of outboard gear, like pitiful. Now, like looking back, so that Nashville was different from New York or LA in that even the more expensive rooms didn't have a lot of equipment. Engineers typically bought their own gear and brought it with them. And if the engineers worked on really big records, i.e. country records, you could rent your gear back to the record even and make some money. Back when there was money. Pour a little out for hookers and blow, right? I'm kidding! Kidding. Mostly kidding. But because of that, I got to learn one room really, really well and meet a lot of different personalities in terms of producers and engineers. Right before my internship ended, an engineer offered me the prestigious position of unpaid intern with him going forward. So he was a guy who was frequently there as an engineer, and he liked something that I was doing, and he was like, "Hey, would you like to help me out going forward?" I didn't have anything else going on, so I said, "Yeah." So then I had the benefit of learning one guy's way of doing things, but in multiple rooms back when there were multiple rooms. Because he had his own gear. He had a gear rental company, so he had a lot of gear, and so his gear would get carted from studio to studio based on the job, and I could learn different rooms by being with him. And I could do this, stepping back. The manager of Hummingbird had a contact at a tape duplication plant. Sorry, this is duplicate information.
Oh, no, that's fine.
A tape duplication plant called NTC, National Tape Corporation. And it was a large-scale cassette duplicate. Do you guys even know what the fuck cassettes are? Cassette duplication. Actually, do you guys know Welcome to 1979? That really cool studio? That studio is the building that was National Tape Corporation. So if you've been in the control room of Welcome to 1979 and we're sitting at the console, if you looked over your left shoulder into the back corner, that's where quality control was, and that's where I worked. Quality control with cassettes is bullshit. There's no quality control, but that's what I did. Second shift. So I would go to studios in the morning, and about 1:30 or so, I'd have to find my way to West Nashville, which is harder than you think without GPS. If you're born in a cornfield and you don't realize that the city in which you've lived is not parallel and perpendicular streetwise. Music Row is perpendicular to the rest of Nashville, and it took me 2 months to figure that out. I got lost every day getting to work almost. But anyway, so I'd go to West Nashville and do my 8 hours, and oftentimes at the end of the shift, I would either go back to where I had been interning, or engineers, if you're nice to them, will often be nice to you, and I would approach them and say, "Hey, is there ever a time that you're not working at this studio where I'm interning, that it would be okay for me to come watch what you're doing somewhere else?" And there were a few engineers who were cool with that, so I would leave my job and then find my way to wherever they were working late at night and hang out for a few hours before finding my bed. So anyway, a few months into the internship, the engineer's name is Doug Sarrett. You probably don't know him, but you know Dougie? Yeah, he's a great guy. So he took me under his wing. He did a lot of not hip music, he would admit that. But he did do a lot of full orchestra stuff. And coming from Indiana University, I had a huge background in orchestral recording, so it worked out really well working with him. And the way, as fate would have it, the way things go, one day we were working at yet another studio that doesn't exist anymore, Quad Studios, which is on Grand Avenue between
It's like
19th, 18th, 19th.
Yeah.
It's a publishing company now. It only recently became a publishing company. It was sold. Because there was Quad Nashville had nothing to do with Quad New York, but long after my tenure at Quad Nashville, it was bought by Quad New York.
Right.
But Quad had been a single room facility back in the 70s. Neil Young's Harvest Moon, some of that was done there. Lots of classic stuff that's not even country was done there.
I think even Margaritaville.
Really?
I think so. Because there's a bathroom upstairs with a stained glass window from Jimmy Buffett.
Oh, is that what the stained glass is from?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
I just figured that was Coke money. Cause,
It might have been. It might be both.
But anyway, we were at Quad one day. By the time I moved to town, Quad had become a multi-room facility with 4 rooms, hence they kept the name Quad. Because back when it was Quad in the 70s, it was because of quadraphonic sound, which is the precursor to surround.
Didn't they also have a Quad 8 console at the beginning?
I think they might have.
Because it was the same guy, House of David.
Yeah, David Riggs. Briggs,
and
which, side note,
player.
Fast forwarding many years, when I put my own room in East Nashville, I bought the plate reverb from House of David from David, which had originally been installed in Quad when he was one of the owners there. So
That's
now
amazing.
own a plate that worked at the same studio where.
Oh my gosh! Yeah.
Going back to my
all
story, one day I'm there with Doug Sarrett, working in the room that was called the Trident room because it had a Trident A-range console, which was an amazing console, as opposed to the TSM, which was shit. The TSM was kind of the heavily IC'd version of what the A-range had been. The A-range was discrete, and the TSM, they have the same slider EQs trying to look like an A-range, but it was not an A-range. Anyway, we're at Quad, and as most audio stories go, I was interning for Doug, but I'd been around a lot because we had worked at Quad a lot. And the manager poked his head in and asked Doug to come out in the hall. And they were gone a few minutes, and then Doug came back in, and he was like, "Hey, man, Kelly, the manager, just pulled me aside. They just fired one of their guys. Do you want a job?" And so I got my first paid gig because somebody got fired that day.
Wow.
Yeah. So my first,
that day? Did you start immediately?
Going forward, yeah. So by that next weekend, I was working on the weekend. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was my first paid position. So I was able to quit NTC around the same time that I was actually getting married at the same time. My second or third day at Hummingbird, I met the girl who would become my wife because she worked at a booking agency 2 doors away on the same floor, and they didn't have a copier, and we didn't have a fax machine. So as an intern, she was always coming in to make copies, and I was always going to send faxes. And
I didn't know. I knew that it happened around that. I was going to ask you that. I didn't want to bring her into this.
No, it's cool because eventually, as most good Nashville, she's not from Nashville, but she'd been here a year, but as most good Nashville girls did back then, the way to ask a guy out was to see if he had a church yet, and I didn't. And she asked if I wanted to go to church, and I was like, sure. And she asked where to pick me up, and we discovered that we lived 2 buildings apart at an apartment complex off of Briley and Elm Hill Pike. Thus began the most convenient courtship in history. Anyway, 16 months later, we were getting married. I was starting a job at Quad, which really pissed Kelly Pribble off, the manager at Quad, because a week into my gig, I had to ask for some time off for my honeymoon, and he was actually pissed. I'm like, dude, it's my honeymoon, man.
Yeah.
It's like, I didn't plan for your last guy to get fired in the midst of my marriage stuff, you know? So,
wow.
But thus began my first paid gig at Quad, which by paid, regardless of whether these are $1992 or not, they offered me the whopping salary of $200 a week, no taxes taken out, and I worked whenever they needed me. In spite of it being a 4-room facility, there were 2 guys employed as assistants, and we weren't on shifts at the same time. One guy would work the nights and days, and one guy would work the nights. And then we would swap every other week who did which so that we could try to pretend like we had a life.
Yeah.
But we got smart and realized if the night guy did the weekends, the day guy kind of felt like he had an extra day off. So we started this thing where the night guy would kill himself and go ahead and do the weekend shift so that when you left at Friday afternoon, you didn't come back until Monday late afternoon. So it was cool. The bummer was you didn't really get the assisting experience as an assistant because you had 4 rooms to be the guy for. So mostly you were setting up and tearing down. Unless one of the rooms wasn't heavily booked, and then you could kind of hang out a little bit, but not really, because you're also the phones guy and the message taking guy and the runner and everything else. There were interns sometimes, but it wasn't a great assisting experience. And because of that, not too many months after taking the job, I left because there was a big CCM duo, brother-sister duo back then by the name of BB and CC Winans, whom you may or may not have heard of, amazing singers. But BB would work there a lot. Actually back to Hummingbird, the very first record I assisted on as an intern was a BB and CC record for Keith Thomas. Yeah, Different Lifestyles, which is an amazing record that they did. It was my first credit, was that record. It was really cool. Even though I made coffee, but the production assistant for Keith Thomas at the time was an IU grad.
Okay.
So my first day at Hummingbird, by coincidence, was the day they were setting up to do overdubs, and like my heart melted because it's like I know the only person I knew in Nashville was there setting up a record. So it was actually really cool.
That's amazing.
But anyway, fast forward to the next year, and BB asked if I would like to be his overdub engineer when he was producing vocals on his sisters, Angie and can't remember, but his sisters were making a duo record of their own, and BB was producing it. And I'm not going to say no to BB Winans, so I didn't ask the manager. Oops. But I set it up that the other night shift guy, who was a country engineer that, to my knowledge, still works in Nashville, a guy named Ricky Cobble. We were both staff guys at Quad. I was like, hey, Ricky, BB asked me to do this. And he's like, well, you have to do this. I was like, can you cover my ass? And he said, yeah. Well, when the manager found out, he was pissed. It's like, dude, you're paying me $200 a week. You're not taking taxes out. Technically, I'm contract labor, and you're going to be mad at me for taking a gig that pays more than you pay me a week for one day's work?
Right.
So in talking to my now wife, I was like, this is kind of weird. I feel like as an independent assistant, I could make more in 2 days of just normal freelance assisting as I can a whole week not knowing what's happening in Quad. So I kind of checked in with a couple of the people that I had worked with to say, hey, if I was independent, is there a chance that you would hire me? And they were like, yeah, I'm sure something could come up. And so I did. I quit. And the first question that Kelly asked me, is it about the money? You think? Are you really asking that question? Yeah, it's about the money. And it's also about the experience, just not really getting the full-on assisting experience. So I went independent, and one of my first clients was getting a call back weeks later from Quad. Somebody was coming in to use the Trident room, and they wanted an assistant who could be with them the whole time. So I became the number one call on their call list for independent assistants, making $15 an hour, usually $150 a day. So in 2 days I made 50% more than I had made. Not that it's all about the money, but it's a little bit about the money.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're trying to get food. Yeah, if you're trying to do it as a job, there's a certain degree that it has to be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that client was an engineer by the name of Tom Lonnie, who's no longer engineering much, but Tom became one of the guys who would call me often. And couple of years, 2 or 3 years later, we ended up doing the first record. He was engineering, I was assisting, but the first record that a producer by the name of Charlie Peacock, who later went on to do Civil Wars and all kinds of great stuff. But the first record that he did at his new studio at this place called the Art House was Tom Lonnie engineering and me assisting. And we ended up doing a couple of records there for Charlie as that team. and Charlie kind of liked how I'd do anything, and whatever needed to be done, I'd do. And the next record that was made by the artist that we did the first record there on, their next record came up, and the label pushed Charlie to use a big name engineer. So we ended up hiring a guy by the name of Elliot Shiner to engineer the next record. And Elliot had done Steely Dan and Donald Fagen's solo stuff, and he had just done the Eagles had gotten back together and done a live record called Hell Frozen Over, something like that, because they had said they'd never get back together unless hell froze over. So Elliot did that record. So Elliot came in as the tracking first engineer on that, and most of the budget was shot hiring the big name guy. So the label, this label, the label pushed for cheers. The label pushed for the hiring of a big engineer, but didn't necessarily adjust the numbers for that. So a lot of Charlie's budget was gone. So he pulled me aside and was like, "Would you be interested in being the overdub guy on this record?" Sure. So he didn't pay me, I don't think, much more than what my assisting fee would have been, but I got to be a first engineer on a good bulk of this record. And thus began a multi-year relationship, working for Charlie as kind of his first call guy. And eventually that moved into mixing some stuff that wasn't necessarily the stuff that he had to use somebody else on to mix. He ended up starting a small label, and I was around during that, so I got to work on some of the records for that. Which actually, Switchfoot was one of the signings to that label. That's when they got started. So I got to do their very first record when the bass player was still in high school, and John was 18, and Chad was in college, and so that was part of that relationship. And then that label got sold, and eventually I moved on to other things, because a couple of the records that I got to do for Charlie there, although they weren't necessarily commercial successes, some people liked how they sounded, and eventually I started getting called to mix for other people and engineer for other people, and ended up going down a mix path because of that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I know, because I met you in 2009.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
You're old.
I know. It was like it was your son's first day of school.
Wow!
I remember you had the sticker and you put it on the gear.
Yeah, it's still there.
Spot. Yeah.
It's still there, yeah.
Anyway.
That's amazing.
He's in middle school now, point of reference. That was a while ago.
He's 13. Wow. He has BO and bald hair. Allegedly.
Allegedly. Who's to say? So, yeah, because when I met you, you were pretty much exclusively mixing. It was pretty rare. Oh, of course, I was only with you for 3 months, but...
No, it was people like to pigeonhole folks.
Yeah.
There was a period of time where mixing was the pinnacle for some reason.
Yeah.
And so there were a few engineers, Chris Lord and Tom Lord, I don't track, and a few other guys, I don't. So then, as some guys would make their way into the mixing ranks, I don't track. And so people just assumed if you mixed that you didn't track, and I've never personally felt that way. I actually enjoy... I don't miss the days where what I mostly did was tracking and overdubs and occasionally get to mix, because when you do that, you don't really get to see your wife.
Yeah.
Maybe she liked it better. I don't know, but it's possible. But I never really told anybody that I don't track, because I enjoy that. I pick, still to this day, I pick up mix tricks from the guitar player. Like they'll do something, like guitar players do. And you're like, oh, I'll stow that away. I'll try that on something later. But so I did get pigeonholed as a mixer, even though I never said I'm only a mixer.
Right. Because I remember you had and for the people listening here, in 2009, your rig was kind of what you described of other engineers in Nashville, like having your Elko patch bay and your road cases of gear. So it was pretty much a permanent setup, and you were mixing through like hardware inserts and all that with a console, but it was still where you could just unplug I don't know how many Elkos and then send it off and go track elsewhere. So, and then you had, I remember like cases in the hallway of microphones. So, And what was that transition like to where like getting? Did that take a long time, or you got pigeonholed and you're like, why is all this stuff in the hallway? Or
Well, kind of, because
Really?
What year would that have been?
that was 09. You were at
09.
Pentaveret at the
So
time.
a year or two before that, I had actually sold off some stuff because it got to the point where pretty much the only guaranteed tracking I was going to do was every couple of years I would go down to Waco, Texas for this band that I had worked with on a number of records and spend a month down there making a record. So I had cases of stuff that honestly, for the most part, didn't get taken out of the cases except for once every 2 years. So not long before you came around,
Yeah.
I actually sold off a bunch of tape delays and vintage analog synthesizers and all kinds of stuff that I knew were still cool, and I was still using them as mix tricks and stuff. But it was so much hassle compared to the plug-in side and recallability and all that it didn't really make sense anymore for me to have gear that I wasn't using unless it could specifically be used for a mix. Like
Right.
I had I'm such a dumbass. I had a pair of Telefunken V76 mic pre's that got turned on once or twice a year that I sold.
I remember somebody in this room had like they were the
1272s.
Yeah, I remember
I had the
those.
1272s, yeah. But a few pieces like that really didn't work in the mix situation so much, so it just, so I got rid of it.
Yeah.
Never, for whatever reason, never really thinking that there would be a time down the road where I'd have my own room. Because at the time I was set up in a place in Berry Hill. It's still called Pentaveret. Bobby Holland. Anybody know Bobby Holland? Bobby's room is I was in that room for 11 years. But I was mostly mixing. So, I just got rid of the stuff that just was sitting there to buy other stuff that I could mix with, which I'm not sad about. I'm sad about that. Because I never imagined that just a few years later I'd have a place that would be just mine, and I would be trying to get some tracking stuff back. So
Yeah.
I was stupid. Don't ever sell anything.
Wow. So how did you go from? Well, how did you collect the gear to do tracking and stuff like that? Was it just time and saving and buying?
Yep.
There's no magic secret.
There's no magic secret.
There's no quick
I
clickbait
definitely don't have a
article you
sugar
can make
mama.
about
I'll
it.
tell you that much, man. Yeah. So no, it was just part of your income became
The gear fund.
Yeah, and I've always been fortunate enough to have a partner in life who is okay with the saying you spend money to make money, and she's always been pretty cool about that. So she understands, and most of the time the stuff, if you buy smart, like either buy lightly used or cut, sort of like cars. If you buy smart, you're not really going to lose money. You can at least get back on it what you spent. I mean, there are a number of pieces in my collection that probably aren't worth what I paid for them originally, but when you consider the amount of use, if you depreciate it yourself like you would for taxes anyway, it actually does make sense. But it's just a matter of deciding what you need and
Well, I don't want to eat up all the time, but I think I just kind of want to maybe bring us to the present dates. That way these guys kind of know where you are now. And because you were there, you were mostly mixing, and then you, and I don't remember if I ever heard kind of the reason behind shifting to your own place, or just you kind of saw the opportunity.
Man,
now
honestly,
you have your own place.
it's kind of selfish. I had a great thing going at Pentaveret in that I didn't pay the owner of the building a lease payment long before we had worked out. I went there. The owner of the building hired me to mix a record for a guy that I had mixed his first record 4 years before, an amazing artist. And the guy who owned the building and one of the guys in one of the rooms in the building had co-produced this record, and they asked me to come in and mix it. And I loved how the room sounded. Like, it just, even though it wasn't, like, looking back, it wasn't a technically amazing sounding room, just, it was back when you went from room to room to room, it was really important to always have some reference material that you knew. And the first time I switched between my mix and the reference material that day, it was right. And it was like, for whatever reason, that room, the way I like to hear the room, spoke back that way. So it was awesome. So I ended up there for 11 years. The last 2 or 3 years of that relationship, so he never really charged me a lease. He had a day rate in the beginning, but over the years, as the music business ship began to sink, nobody had a day rate. You got what you could. So the guy was really cool that if a client did have the money for the day rate, that's what I would pay him. But otherwise, I would pay him his percentage of the total of what I made plus the studio would make. I would just take that percentage off the top of any budget that came in and write him a check before I cut myself a check or anything else. So that went on for 11 years, and it was cool until the last couple of years where the owner wasn't really interested in being in the music business anymore, is how it felt. And one day I realized that I was doing the dishes and I was taking out the trash and I was cleaning the toilet if I didn't want to be embarrassed when my clients were coming in for mix changes or whatever.
Yeah.
I was like, wait a minute, I'm paying more than anybody in the building, even though the other guys in the building were paying a lease thing, and I knew pretty much what each of them were paying. When I looked, every April 15th, when I looked at what I had spent on studio the year before, I was like, son of a bitch, man. Like, that's a lot of scratch.
Yeah.
But it was cool at the same time because if, for whatever reason, I didn't have some work, I didn't have to worry about a payment. But as time went on and I realized that I was mopping and sweeping and everything else, I was like, if I'm going to do this, I might as well have my own place. So I started looking. We've lived in this neighborhood for 22 years as of November. And so when I began, everybody kind of now does the bonus space thing for a mix room or whatever. You buy a house with room over the garage or a basement or whatever. And that's awesome if you're buying a newer house, but we loved this neighborhood. And at that time, 4 years ago, a little over almost 4.5 years ago, there wasn't new construction over here, so you weren't going to find a house with bonus space. You were lucky to find a house with more than one bathroom.
Yeah.
So we really weren't interested in leaving the neighborhood, but the search began for something to accommodate. And there was one house towards the end of McGavick where they had taken the roof off of a vintage house and they were adding a second story. And once they had added the second story, we snuck into the new construction like you do. And it's like, oh, there's a bonus space over the garage. This is what we're talking about. No idea how much it was going to be. So I have a realtor buddy. And I was like, man, can you keep an eye out? So he was keeping an eye out for when it would list so we would have an idea if it was even possible. Well, in the meantime, I would check realtor.com almost every day to see if it had popped up yet. And I was looking through houses in the neighborhood during an ear break. And I saw my street name in the sidebar list of houses, and my street's only 2 blocks long.
Right.
I was like, there's no house for sale on my street. I would know that. And so I clicked on it, and I knew the house. It had been remodeled back in 06, because I remember having the Naz, my son, and my wife, we were out doing something. We had peeked in the window to see what was going on, because there was construction going on. I remember seeing where they had poked holes in the wall to run new electric and all that back in 06. So I knew the house, and I knew that it was, a lot of it was updated, even though it was a small house. I knew that there was solid stuff there, and the price wasn't bad. My wife was out of town, so I called her to say, I've got a wild hair, but I think this is going to work. I called my realtor, and we put an offer in. And so I ended up buying a little house on my street for the monthly payment being a fraction of what I would have paid Pentaveret monthly, and it's a piece of real estate that I own. Knowing full well that I'm completely illegal, as opposed to you being legal. I think you're zoned for it here, but I do know that. And I have invited my councilman over for beer to talk about that. So I'm anxious for some legislation to happen to make me legal, but it made the most sense for me and my family. So I get to walk to work every day, and so that's now.
Awesome.
But I got to go back to tracking some. It's a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house, so the living room, dining room situation across the front of the house, smaller than this, but that became my control room. And over time, the 2 bedrooms, the one I treated as a dead space first, and then the other one we took the ceiling out and went all the way up to the roof line. So now I have an 18-foot wall that slopes down to 8 feet for a drum room, and it has a full basement, so I have a couple guitar lockers down there and a makeshift lounge vibe. And I've been able to get back to tracking some, which has been cool. It's not often, but once a month or so, sometimes multiple days, but yeah.
That's great. Well, I guess the last thing I'll ask you before we either push pause and people get refills, or we'll probably push pause and let people get refills. If somebody wants to hire you to track or to mix, how do they go about getting in touch with you?
ShaneDWilson.com. There's a contact page on there.
It's very cool.
Yeah.
Music City Listeners is brought to you by 4115, the East Nashville recording studio dedicated to serving up homestyle recordings since 2012. And Music City Content Kings, a creative photo and video production company that believes in transparency and value. Good to Go, serving up the goodness from our favorite food truck and catering events for people who have good taste. And Handmade Productions, a couple of wildly talented dudes making all things music and video.
All right, well, let's bring it back. Let's bring it back together. I know I got to talk to some of you guys, and some of you are musicians, some are engineer people, some of you sell real estate and engineer things, some of you are lawyers. Some of you have been my intern. I know, right? We got to be careful.
I gotta go.
Gotta go. They found
My studio is totally legal. Get off my ass.
Don't worry. That person I just talked to, and he's trying to figure out the same thing for himself. So I was like, you might actually be able to tell us with accuracy what the law says. And
I know what the law says.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, I actually emailed Megan Berry back and forth on that.
What's that?
Megan Berry,
Yeah.
back and forth on it. She somehow gave me like an approval.
She wrote amazing legislation in 2011 when she was on the council.
But it didn't go through.
It got nicknamed the Home Studio Bill, and it scared the shit out of people in certain neighborhoods. And it even with the president of the musicians union coming forward and saying, it's not that studios are going to come to your neighborhood. They started in the rich neighborhoods because big producer engineers like Scott Hendricks and other guys realized that, instead of paying $400 to Hummingbird Studios, I'll pay that to myself and we'll just do overdubs at my home. Once ADATs and Tascam D88s and other things happened, that started happening, and it started happening in the rich neighborhoods first. Like East Nashville was not the first neighborhood with a recording studio, most likely. But so she wrote great legislation. But because it got called the Home Studio Bill instead of the Home Business Bill, it got tabled, and then she became mayor, and you can't have legislation in the council if you're not on the council.
That I didn't know.
That's why it got permanently tabled, is because she won the election. So, and it's not exactly high on her list of priorities. Because even when I had Anthony Davis over I wanted him to come to my studio. He's a friend. He's a beer enthusiast. This is his brewery. Like, I love what he does now for a business. He started a brewery over on Trinity Lane. So I've been in touch with him as my councilman and as a beer guy. I was like, man, come over, take a look. I want you to. I want to talk to you about this. And he walked in, and I think he saw. The little, the joke that you see on Facebook, the meme that's like, I'm hitting the studio, and it's like a Fisher Price thing.
Yeah.
Like, that's not exactly what was in his mind, but it was because he's in a small band, I think, too. So he had an idea, and he walked in, and he was like, like, this isn't a house. I was like, no, this is, and I was like, I'm not trying to escape taxes or something. My clients only have so much money.
yeah.
And if I want any of that money, I need to be able to provide the space in which they create, or I'm not going to make any money. So I'm sorry, I feel like I'm talking about money a lot, and I don't mean that, because that's not, the money's only important because I need to keep a roof over my head and the electricity turned on. It's not really about the money until it comes down to making a living. And that's part of the decision of having the space. I was like, man, if you go to the council and you want to dangle the carrot of taxation, I can only speak for myself and a couple of my friends who I know feel this way. Dangle that carrot, man. I'm not trying to get around a business license or anything like that. I'm just trying to affordably provide a space in which I can help my friends and clients make the best art that they can without going broke. That's all this is about. And he totally understood, but he was just beginning the Google fight when I had him over, the Google Fiber fight. He's the one who got Google to come here. So he's in the thick of that. And then there's also some quality stuff that he's been a big part of. And he just, there's only so much time per council person to focus on something. And stinky musicians aren't one of those things right now, I guess. So, anyway, sorry.
No,
Tangent.
That's great. That's what we're here for.
These are the things that keep me up at night.
Well, that's, I think, what we're all here to hear about.
Yeah.
So that's great.
You're always making sure you're being nice to the neighbor, picking that litter up out of their yard.
From the stinky musicians.
No, actually not. That's
Oh,
just,
good,
That's
good.
just called living in East Nashville.
Oh, yeah.
Unfortunately.
There's always litter. Always litter. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. What questions do you guys have besides where did these amazing raps come from?
Where did these amazing raps come from, Dewey?
I want to put a good plug in for our neighbor across the street in the crazy looking, wonderful orange food truck. He's kind of over that way. Good to go, Nashville. Fantastic eat. Chef D will treat you right. So there you go. Look, supporting the neighbors. Yeah. What questions do you guys have?
So, in your career so far, what have you worked on that you're proudest of at this moment?
Andy, how do I usually answer this sort of question? I don't know. I don't know if we've ever actually talked to. Andy Osenga is a dear friend of mine and a guy that I've made a number of records with, and I love him very much. But I don't know if we've ever talked about this. But I have a hard time answering that question because I can honestly tell you that there are very few pieces of recorded music that I've been a part of that I've ever listened to after I was done with it. I don't know if anybody else has that problem in the room. Just me? Okay, great. But and I know that it's totally psychological, but it's sort of, there's a cliche joke. There's a poet who once said that good poems are never finished, only abandoned. And the reality is recorded music is the same way. And because of that, as the engineer, I probably picked the wrong career in terms of something to do for someone who doesn't have the most amazing self-esteem, because a lot of your job is somebody telling you what you did wrong. Now, I know that that's not necessarily how producer Andy would phrase that if he were bringing changes to me, and I openly admit, and we have talked about this, I openly admit that that's not what he's saying when he says, hey man, could you turn the snare up a dB? What I hear is, dude, you fucked that snare up, man. And I'm being straight up honest with you that, and especially once the era of ProTools came and mixing was my main job, when I'm mixing sometimes for 2 or 3 people a day, different artists, whether it's actively mixing the song from the first note or doing recalls because they've sent me an email or a text or a phone call to tell me what I did wrong / what needs to be changed, however you want to look at it. So almost daily there's an onslaught of, even if it's framed as nicely as it can be, there's an onslaught of what I didn't get right the first time. Now, I do know that that's subjective, that there's a million ways to EQ that snare drum. There's a million ways to position that vocal. There's a million ways to leave something in or take something out. I totally know that. But in the thick of it, sometimes, or for me, most of the time, what you hear is, here's what you did wrong. It makes it incredibly difficult for me to hit play and enjoy something after that. So, are there records that have done really well? Yeah. Are there records that haven't done well at all that are artistically amazing? Yeah. But I couldn't honestly tell you that, oh, please go grab this because I kicked its ass. Because I don't honestly feel that way. And I can't hit play on most any of it. Every once in a while, like especially back when you could actually listen to radio, something would come on and you'd be like 4 bars in and you're like, oh shit, I did this. That's cool. But that's few and far between. So I'm sorry. I mean, there's examples on the webpage or there's incomplete stuff on AllMusic or Artist Direct, but I honestly couldn't tell you that please go listen to this because I love it. Because I do love so much of what I do. I mean, that EP I did with you just, 2 years ago? Which one was that? Was it Soul? Soul, yeah. He came in, they tracked at my place, and then I got to mix 5 songs? Something like that.
Yeah,
it was so awesome in the moment, and I loved it, and I feel like, Andy loved it. I think he loved it. I hope he loved it. I heard really nice things from other. Yeah, but it's on Amazon Cloud. We can run back over there on the way home, man. But there's stuff that I know is artistically beautiful, but I couldn't tell you that I listened to it and would tell you why, because it's honestly really hard. Because I can only hear what I didn't do or should have done, or knowing that they maybe weren't 100% happy, but it had to go to mastering. So, yeah. That's a bummer. Anybody for another beer?
Yeah.
That being said, I mean, there are some great artists that I've worked with. Ben Rector, Andy Osanga's stuff is beautiful. There's a new girl, Ellie Holcomb, that I've loved working for her. Although it's not necessarily something I would consume as a consumer, but just working with her, and I feel like the music is from such an honest place, and her producers are amazing. I probably could say I'm proud of that stuff, but I haven't actually heard it since it got back from mastering, but just because of those reasons, because I'll just hear it and go, oh man, I wish I would have, but I know I'm leaving out a million things after 20-some years, but there's a lot of good stuff out there. A year ago, one of the first things I tracked in my space was this band Neon Noah from Texas that nobody's heard of, and they just broke up. Like it was a year ago, and it's an amazing EP, I think. But I think, because I haven't really listened to it since it was done. But yeah, they already are splitting up, which is a bummer.
Oh man.
A whole history of that too. I mean, you work at this long enough, and that's the other thing is, you spend so much time on these records and so much time with these people, right, Andy? And like, back in my Charlie Peacock days, there were more hours a week that I spent with this man than I did my wife. And, you invest in these artists and these things, and most of them don't have record deals anymore, and most of them you've never heard of. And, it's a hard road sometimes because it's all about passion, right? Like, even if it's not music you're into, it's art, it's passion, and it's love, and it's sex, and it's hatred, and it's bloody, and it's beautiful, and you get really close to it, which is probably why another reason it's hard to go back. You just get so inside of it, and then sometimes nobody listens to it, and bands break up, and artists get dropped, and people go bankrupt and get divorced, and it's a long road of that. I think Jessica White, anybody?
Yeah.
There's love in it, but there's hate, there's madness. Sorry, I don't have a great answer for that other than to say all of the shit I just said.
Look at your credits.
Don't do that.
He's got him pulled up right
One
there.
of them that stands out that I've always loved the sound is David Crowder Records. Can you give us any tidbits on some of the process and any mix techniques or any you used on that? Because I've always loved the sound of those records.
In the early days, it was so collaborative, and that was a month at a time. Who was I just talking to about the Yeah. So I would load my gear onto a U-Haul or a budget rental truck, and my assistant and I would drive 12, 13 hours down to Waco, and we would stay for a month. Usually almost around this time. It was usually middle March to middle of April, or beginning of April to beginning of May. I can't remember, but it was 4 weeks. We would take an extended weekend in the middle so that we could have conjugal relations back home, and then go back to Waco for the rest of the week. It's not a joke.
No, I know. I'm about to go on the road for 10 days. I know what you're talking about.
Man has needs.
Has needs.
No, but we would take an extended break in the middle, which actually is part of the story, because especially there was one particular record in that canon. There was a record called A Collision, which for me was kind of the apex of that time. I know Crowder's doing great stuff now, but for the David Crowder Band time, that was kind of the apex. And it was a really weird thing to record, because Crowder, in his way of doing things, would, so today we need to, we're going to record the guy coming down the stairs, and then later we're going to record the guy going up the stairs. And then he would, we'd talk about something else. And I'd be like, hey, I'm sorry, man. What? What are we? Oh, yeah, so the guy's going to go up and then, something, and then we'd go on to something else. And what I realized after the mix was that whole record, which was a long play, like for iTunes, they ended up dividing it, I think, into 4, A, B, C, and D or something. But in his head, it was a long play. And that was in his head from conception. And he was just never very good at sitting me down and going, okay, Dullard, here's what I'm saying. The record's going to start with this song, and it's going to end with this song. And at some point, you're going to hear the guy walking up the stairs, and then the hoedown is going to be happening upstairs when he gets to the top of the stairs, and we're going to open the filter up. That was all in his head, but it never actually made it out of his mouth for me to understand what the fuck we were doing. Until the mix. And then I was like, oh, dude, all you had to say was this, and I would have totally known what we were doing. But so it was collaborative in that we all weighed in on sounds and all that. But those records were really kind of special because they were already done in his head. Almost.
So you tracked it as well as mixed it?
The early stuff I did. The first record was co-produced by a guy named Brent Milligan. Can You Hear Us? Is that it? I think something like that. And then the next one, they mostly self-produced. And then from then on, they mostly self-produced. And I was involved in at least the self-produced stuff. Until towards the end, right before they broke up, the last 2 or 3 records, they started actually self-recording more even. And I would be brought in as consultation, whatever that means. I got to go to Waco and eat at a couple of my favorite restaurants and say, yeah, you guys are doing good, I'll go, And then I would mix.
Sure.
But yeah, those, like.
Was most of that in the box or outside of the box?
It was, well, I mean, the tracking was 2 Pro Tools. I had a lot of gear that I would take down. Eventually they had their own gear. In fact, Crowder owns my V76s. That's who owns mine, because he loved them on his vocal and. Yeah. And actually, when I put my room in, I called him to ask, hey man, are you using those? Oh yeah, I love them. Those are my favorite pre's. But if I were to sell them to anybody, I'd sell them to you. But I knew what they were worth at that point, which was infinitely more than they were even. I got way more out of them when I sold them to him than what I paid for them, because I literally got them from Germany, and some kid in Jersey racked them up. And then when I sold them to Crowder, they were worth 4 times what I had in them. And then if I had bought them back, they were worth twice what he paid me. I was like, yeah, that's a new roof. I can't do that. So, but anyway, so yes, we tracked in, but I mean, it was through very analog gear. And then my technique, since when I went to Pro Tools, it was with a gun to my head. This is how you get, everybody's doing this. This is how you have to do it. Okay, I'll do it. And then I did it, and those same record companies, you know what I'm talking about, who told me that I needed to go in the box, didn't want to hire me anymore because I was in the box. Like, wait a minute, I went into debt for you people. What? So, but over time, what I developed after being completely in the box for not a long period of time, but a long enough period of time that I made some records that I'm really not proud of. As much as I have a hard time with any of them, there's a period of time where the trend was to do a certain thing, and I didn't hear that way, I think. And honestly, the mixer, the actual math and science of Pro Tools back then was shit compared to what it is now. Like, looking back, the 001, the prosumer line of Pro Tools really did mathematically, scientifically sound better, in spite of what Avid DigiDesign told us for so long. The math made more sense in the 001 LE version of Pro Tools than it did the TDM version of Pro Tools, because what we're on now is a floating 32-bit mixer, which is what 001 was from the beginning. It was a 32-bit, a floating 32-bit mixer, and TDM was fixed 48-bit and truncation and masturbation and everything else. But so, I had the expensive TDM rig because that's what you had to have, right? And, it just didn't sound as good. But what I did discover via some friends, Richie Biggs, who ended up working for Charlie Peacock, and Richard Dodd, who is God. Dodd rhymes with God. Did you notice that? Because I did. They found ways that, if you divide the workload and everything isn't going out 2 channels, if you can divide that to 8 or 16 or 24 and do submixes and then combine analog, it sounds better. So, long way around saying that early on I did develop a really, really, as hybrid as you can get, which I am to this day. At Pentavert, I was on a Trident ADC. At Charlie Peacock's, it was a TAC matchless, and now I have a Shadow Hills Equinox. So I'm mixing in the box, but I'm using hardware inserts, and I'm using analog stuff on the 2 bus, and so it's as hybrid as you can get, and it has been for the better part of 15 years or so now. So it really is a big mixture, and on those records it was as well. Long-winded answers. I'm sorry. Yes.
In your opinion, what is a perfect album that someone else has done?
Oh, geez. Wow. Perfect album. A record that still brings me to tears is Buddy. What's Buddy's last name? The Americana. Buddy Miller. His what's the churchy titled record that he had where he cut Dylan's "God on Our Side"? Right? What album is that? You know the album I'm talking about, though. I still cry. I'll put it on in the car, and especially in our current political climate, that cover. It's a cover, and it just wrecks me. But I love that record. I love. There was an album on Madonna's label, a guy named Jude something. You remember him? Yeah. Because he covered Tears for Fears. Perfect. What? Can't remember that song either. But that, I always loved that record. The Bends by Radiohead. But are they perfect? I don't know. But they moved me.
What is a perfect album to you?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, is there?
Just moves you emotionally?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Oh, you're asking what makes a perfect album? Absolutely.
In your opinion.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's something that moves me. Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's an older CCM artist by the name of Russ Taff, who was in a band called the Imperials when he was younger, and then he was a solo guy, and he had a couple of records that, as a kid, wrecked me, and I didn't know why necessarily, and then later when you got to meet people who were involved in the record, you find out all this emotional stuff that was involved, and it's funny because in my mind, I just remember crying, listening to that, just singing at the top of my horrible voice, and crying. And then you go to play it for your wife. Oh, this record is foundational, and you hit play. Oh my God, this sounds awful. But still emotionally it connects, but you realize, oh my gosh, that was 1986 or 88 or whatever, and things were different, so I do think it's emotion over sonics because, I'll go back and listen to box sets of whomever, and it's like, wow, that, especially now that vinyl's back, you buy foundational records and you throw it on and you're like, I would get fired.
Oh, yeah.
I would totally get fired if my record sounded like this that I was a part of. So it transcends the engineering part, I think. And sometimes it doesn't, Beatles' Abbey Road. I think that is one of the most modern sounding pieces of classic recording you've ever heard. Yeah. So, yeah. I think when you're talking about music, I think it's generally passion over science, generally.
Is there anything you do again different?
Why do you talk funny? Sorry.
Everybody meet Hal.
Is there anything you do again differently or just not do again at all?
Oh yeah, I'd have that accent for damn sure, man. Yeah. No, yeah, I wouldn't. I would totally have skipped the 100% in the box phase for sure. I mean, it was horrible. It was really bad. But you're being hired by people. You're at a good place in your career where you want to keep working for those people. And it wasn't so much. It wasn't even 100% that the technology was so bad. It was, my gear was always mobile. but my gear was mobile so it could move to studios. Well, suddenly your studio was in a fucking box, literally in a fucking box, which was contained in a box with wheels. So you had producers that used to hire great studios for you to work in that suddenly went, hey, you could mix this at my place. Okay, yeah, sure. Untreated basement, most of the time. I've mixed in people's dining rooms. And the one thing I never thought I would need was mobile acoustic treatment, right? So there was a handful of months, a couple of years, where I went ahead and did what people wanted, and probably should have stood my ground and said, you know what, man, this isn't good. We should at least go to Dark Horse. Had that barefoot room. Do you remember that? It was called Barefoot because there was nothing in it, and it was great for a while because once people realized that, oh yeah, making records in somebody's kitchen probably isn't the best idea. So at least we can go into the studio room, even though there's no gear. You can bring all your gear in, and you at least know that it might sound okay. So yeah, I totally would have skipped that phase, looking back.
Would you, a lot of dudes, hey, David.
That's a good answer.
A lot of dudes are mixing all in the box now, major records.
Yeah.
Everything different.
Yeah.
Is that something, you've got all your gear there, but is that something that you would be
Yeah.
less hesitant to do?
Yeah, things have changed. So sorry, I should say that I would have skipped that phase then. But I do think if I wasn't so entrenched in how I do things now, it could totally be done not how I do it now. The mixer alone, literally the internal architecture of ProTools. Studio One, great sounding software. Logic probably has always sounded good, but that's the worst named piece of software I've ever seen in my life. That's the most illogical, unless you're a stone musician, that software makes no sense. But that's what my son's using, I just realized. He's not sharing! But no, I do, now more than ever, I think it's way more doable than it's ever been, just because the math is so much better.
Yeah.
And then UAD, the stuff that they do, plug-in wise, yeah, give me a break, yeah. It can totally be done. Now, that being said, I do think there's still a huge mistake that folks make in that laptop mixing is totally doable. Rocket 5's $200, amazing sounding monitors, right? But cutting the corners on treatment, like not being in an environment where what you're hearing is what you're hearing, because headphones are cool, but it doesn't work the same. It's a good place to check things, but it's not a good place to 100% do things. So I do think, there's no shame in hitting up RLX and having them do the math on your room and spend, if you're gonna go all in the box and you're gonna spend less on tubes and LEDs and meters and all that stuff, do put aside some money to either have somebody come in and check your room out and tell you what needs to be changed, or even, the free service that companies like RLX do, where you give them the dimensions of your room and they make suggestions. Now, I do say that RLX did do my room. I paid for it, but it was artist pricing. But it was amazing that, they came in and they went, oh yeah, this is doable, but you're going to want to do this, this, and this. And I think I have one of the best sounding control rooms I've ever worked in that's a living room. It literally is a living room. But so I say that, yes, it's totally doable, but I still think we need to approach it as pros and be willing to spend a little bit of scratch to know for sure what we're hearing. We owe it to our clients, if nothing else. And if your client is yourself, love yourself. Woohoo! Drinking.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been chewing on this question. I'm not sure if I know how to phrase it, so it might be long-winded, but I wonder if you might talk a little bit about how you view your role and how it may overlap with kind of being a producer on both sides of the. So what's going on in my head? Like, for instance, if you take it upon yourself to first, especially for women, I'm sure you assume that what you're given is like worked hard upon, and you're going to do what you're given. But if you're really hearing something, you take it upon yourself to, use some things or subtract or even add or give them what they gave you, and then if you're really feeling strong, give another version and just say, hey,
There are a few schools of thought on that, and some of that is about self-confidence. But I do 99.5% of the time, I approach it from what I'm given is something that somebody spent some time on and somebody mapped out and they were hearing something not being there or something being there, and that they either put something there or they remove something. So I'm not usually a mixer who approaches things from the place of they're bringing this to me because I need to rearrange it. Every once in a while I'll take something out, but it's not like sweeping. It's usually something that nobody would know was gone. And sometimes it's just because, like, I've never been a fan of pads. Like I just, I think Kotex. It's called a pad. Come on. But sometimes, there's something I'm doing in guitar treatment or something that wasn't done in the production that might overlap, whether it's a heavily feedback echoplex or something like that. That either I'll take something way down or take it out, and somebody might not notice that it's missing just because something's doing the same thing, but it moved me in a way that the other thing didn't. But that's almost rare. Like, I really do work really hard to give the client the best interpretation of what they gave me, because I'm assuming that somebody spent hours away from their wife or significant other to craft what they gave me. And I don't, I'm not a producer. I don't have any production credit because I'm not a producer. And so I'm going to work, I want to work really hard to make the best of what I'm given. Now, because of that, sometimes the mix tweaks that I get are, now that I've heard the mix, we don't need that. Sure. Could we take that out of the verse? Or sometimes I will, nobody put a breakdown in the song or whatever. What would it be like to go down to just the rooms or the mono room or something? But it's not like I'm rearranging the whole thing. Sometimes it's just because the client has heard this for months on end, spending time away from the family, and maybe they're not as excited about it as when they started. So if I just put a 1-bar stop before the last chorus or something, it's like, oh, well, I never heard it that way. But I'm not generally just muting stuff and putting it in the unused bin or something. Usually it's a tiny little sliver of something just to surprise somebody reversing something or. Cool. Yeah. Something.
So just hit some general process then. Let's get a new mix. Like, what are your kind of first broad strokes, or what's your process when you get a new mix? Where's your head?
It kind of usually stuff comes in one of two ways these days. Either they just send me WAV files and I'm starting from faders down like I would on a console, or I'm receiving how they last heard it. I generally ask that plugins and stuff be removed unless it's something that you really are attached to, and then I'm kind of like, oh, if you're attached to it, why don't you commit it? So I don't have to worry about whether or not I need to spend $90 on a plugin I don't have, or whatever. But even when I was on a console, like all on a console, I've never approached a mix. Okay, I'm going to work on the kick, and I'm going to work on the snare. I'm going to work on. I've always felt that, even though I'm not a producer and I'm not a player, music is sort of this holistic experience. It's a whole body kind of a thing. So I want to push everything up if it's not already. And sometimes if I get just the waves, I'll even import a step one from a similar thing that I've done for somebody else, levels and all, just so there's a board mix straight away. So that I'm just I'm hearing what you did as opposed to the individual elements of what you did. I'm really more interested in the whole body than just the eyelashes or whatever. So I just kind of bring it all up and start panning for space and I know that certain chains that I'm most of my hardware inserts are chains, so it'll be a compressor and EQ tied together that I know that I really like that on bass in general, or I really like that on this in general, or I have multiples that are great for guitar, but each one of those I like for a certain type of guitar thing, so I'll start putting that stuff on just to see what it does. And once I have kind of a static thing, I usually then start my automation with the vocal and then just move from there. Usually it's not even I go vocal and then guitar or keys or whatever. I literally go, the one thing I do love about Pro Tools compared to just working off a 2-inch tape is that you can see the music, right? So if I do the vocal first, I see that, oh, you know what, the acoustic starts at the intro and pretty much plays to the last diamond of the song. That's obviously part of the heartbeat of this song, so I'll automate that sort of stuff first and then just sort of chronologically go with what happens next so that the painting kind of comes together as the artist did the brush strokes to
Draw on all your automation.
No,
There you go,
no,
faders or-
faders, yeah. I did the drawing thing for a long time, and it was okay, but
Will you print them or you'll draw them with MIDI?
like with
Run the faders
with
and it'll put in
the
points.
yeah the Euphonics
Yeah.
box is what I use
Yeah,
right
yeah.
now. Yeah, like I did go back to how it was on a console where you're just pushing a fader.
Yeah. And you'll automate vocals first, everything?
Mhm.
Yeah, everything. That needs it.
Pretty much everything.
Pretty
Yeah.
much everything.
Yeah. I don't typically automate bass. Like some of the older-
Pre-compressor or
What's that?
will you automate pre or post compressor? Or
It's
is it
pre-2-bus compression, but it's post-insert compression, yeah. So my inserts are in, hardware inserts in Pro Tools, so there's no inserts on the Shadow Hills.
Now, cut me off whenever. As a mixer, do you do any corrective stuff? Like, do you do any sort of timing or pitch or last
Sometimes,
audio or anything
sometimes.
like that? Or
Yeah, sometimes I try, again, I'm not a producer, but I mean, you know, sometimes you'll get something where you're like, I wonder if they were listening to, because pitch in particular, you can listen to something really loud and it sounds pretty in tune, and I don't typically mix really loud, so sometimes you'll hear something and you're like, I bet they thought this was more in tune than it is, and sometimes I'll put just a light something on, but not very often in that regard.
not like serious vocal.
Not very, every once in a while I'll draw something in, because I know that if I don't, I'm gonna get a new vocal file and have to redo all of my click, declicking and all that stuff, so I'll try to nip that in the bud before we get that far, but that, again, I'm not a producer, so I'm not, and it varies by style too, because sometimes you'll get something here like, yeah, this isn't, it's not Celine Dion.
Right,
thing.
right.
And, you know, I won't go that far, but every once in a while you're like, yeah, they're not gonna be happy with that.
You do all your declicking and debreathing in the volume automation or clip gain?
Clip gain, volume automation, and RX suite. That stuff's amazing.
Yeah.
That's what I'll do though.
Yeah. And I don't debreath. I do I'll every once in a while post compression. They're really loud, and so I'll ride them. But
Yeah, that's what I mean.
yeah, because some people do take them out, and that makes me short of breath when I hear it. So. Why am I not breathing? Oh, because the artist didn't breathe.
You just mentioned generally not automating bass, so I'm wondering like maybe in a CCM thing, if it's coming from like Tony Lucido or Matt Melton or something, where is that tone coming from their rig and their gear and you're just compressing a little bit, or do you find yourself like to really get it to sit?
Bass is one of those things that you can usually compress so hard that no one will ever know that you compressed it. Yeah, and it generally is, honestly. But that goes back to my Tom Lonnie days, who once said, you never automate the low end. Like, not never. Like every once in a while, Tony Lucido is a god. Ask him, he'll tell you. I do worship that guy. And there'll be a lick or something that of course you're gonna ride, but it's not, I don't ride it top to bottom because it's the bass. Right. It's the BASE, it's the foundation. So even when I do drum rides, my kick is not grouped with my drums. So like riding the fill into a chorus or something, I don't group my kick with my drums, and the bass is rarely ridden, unless there's something amazing the bass player did that's not going to be heard unless you ride it up.
Awesome.
Yeah. Now that's not to say that you don't go back and go, wow, that kick is really loud in that breakdown chorus or whatever, and just kind of take it down. But in general, when I'm actually doing emotive riding, the kick isn't part of it.
Are there any particular piece of gear that you'd like to pin bass with? Is there like 2A?
It's usually the two-tech CO1B into a manly full-tech EQ.
Cool.
With like pretty drastic, like the EQ is almost all the way up to the top and the bottom. So it's almost more of a volume boost than it is an EQ. And it's just to kind of get the tubes going, oh my goodness.
Do you mix with stuff on your tube bus, or do you put it on at the end? So you've always got like a compressor and an EQ there, or do you have a set? Just what else in on there? Just compressor EQ?
The Allen Smart stereo compressor, and then I have the Millennia
Oh yeah.
dual topology thing that I think I'm always in the solid state. I don't think I like the tube. I think that's right. Yeah. And then the last thing is I always loved going to half inch. And for a while I was even a partner in a completely mint refurbed ATR 100. But I was the only guy in the partnership that was renting it for the records. Like, remember when it was at the studio all the time? Yeah, I owned that with Russ Long and Britt Milligan. But I was the guy that was always renting it. And so eventually my clients could afford tape, so we'd print a tape and then it would get mastered from tape. And then eventually they didn't have that, and I would buy shop reels, and you can only replace them again. So eventually Russ Long, who was one of the partners, he used to review for Pro Audio Review, was that the name of the magazine? I think. He used to review gear, and he was reviewing the Animod ATS-1. The first thing that Animod made was a tape simulation box. It's 2 rack spaces, and it has 2 switches with 4 positions for 4 tape machines and 4 tape formulations. He was like, hey, you want to try this? I was like, yeah. So I got it, and I put some tape on the tape machine, and I went back and forth and dialed in the settings on the ATS-1 to, like, there's even a tape hiss knob.
Really?
So I matched I recorded some blank audio to the tape, and I measured the tape hiss of my favorite tape, and so I dialed in the same amount of tape hiss on the ATS-1. And eventually, it made sense for me to just buy that, because what I liked about it was it's amazing going to half-inch tape or quarter-inch tape, but when you put it on at the end, doesn't matter what the mix is, it changes. So your client has signed off on X, and you're hitting record to print for mastering, and suddenly the kick is different. Or that tom fill doesn't sound exactly like it did when they signed off on the mix, and you start to get a little paranoid, a little more paranoid than you normally would be. And because you realize that things aren't quite the same. So the cool thing about the ATS-1 is it's always on. I'm always in record. And so the client is always hearing me hitting the tape as hard as I want to. And it really does change how, like, if you hit it harder, it compresses more, and if you hit it softer, it's not. So it's always on. So it's
You're making adjustments to it as you mix, or
well, it's just that's how you're hearing it.
That's just how you need it.
That's just how. No, it stays static.
It just stays static.
So I can look at the meters because it has the meters on. Animod.
Never heard of them.
Really? Yeah, they make the ATS-1. They made, I think that maybe they've gone out of business. I'm not sure, because I just had a piece of gear fixed from them. But they had a 500 series Fairchild 660 copy. The Animod 660.
Is it a rack thing? Is it a rack in it or a plug-in?
No, it's racked. Yeah, and then it's the API 500 series single slot compressor. What else did they do? A couple of, but it's sorry. So it's analog modeling, but there's no digital. So it's mimicking tape and tape machines, but there's no A to D, D to A involved. They did it somehow analog. Oh, Bomb Factory plugins? So it's the guy from Bomb Factory partnered with the guy from Pendulum Audio.
Oh, wow.
Those two guys got together and found an analog way to model gear,
Yeah.
and it's pretty cool stuff.
Check that out.
Yeah.
How's it compared to like the UAD ATR?
I don't know. I mean, I don't have it to compare to, so necessarily, but It's probably similar, but I don't have a 2-bus in Pro Tools to put so if I want to tape, even putting it on my stems wouldn't be the same as putting it on my 2-bus.
Sure.
So this is how I have to do it right now. So, yeah.
Who's your,
Oh God!
Last quick one, who's your go-to mastering guy?
I don't have a go-to.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what it is, and I love, old school Hank Williams, used to be a master mix. His prices have come down because he closed that big building, and I love that guy. And I know everybody thinks country and soft when they think of him, but he's done some of my closest to favorite rock records. I honestly couldn't say, I'm sorry, man, I feel like I need to take you out for a drink. Some rock records that I felt really good about at the time, he's been involved in those. There's a guy who was producing here in town, one of the Colony House producers is a guy named Joe Causey. He's gone into mastering now, and he's killing it. He's doing a great job. Brad Blackwood, Euphonic Masters down in Memphis. Love this guy. He's amazing. Jim DeMay, guest master here in town. Love him. But I don't have one guy.
What?
I would.
How much when you're sending to mastering how much headroom do you send them?
See, I've actually lost records because people didn't know that all they needed to do was turn up the volume when they listen to my mix. I'm tied to VU.
Yeah.
I have been for ever since I got out of the box, I'm tied to VU. So my stuff's never gonna be as loud as an in the box guy.
But you're sending it to a mastering engineer who can bring the volume up.
Exactly, but sometimes the client isn't smart enough to know that.
You don't put just some sort of decoy?
I do. Actually, I put about 40 dB of L2007 on my ref mix, and then I also do, I send everybody 2 versions. I send a ref, which they think is right off the desk, which it's not. But it's not. Usually I have at least 2 dB of headroom across the mix.
Before you send it?
Before it goes to L2007,
Okay.
I'm just bumping it up to 0 dBFS, or minus 0.3.
Is that kind of, was there a school of thought for that, like sending it to a mastering engineer, like how many dB, like,
Well, back in GAC
you ever
days.
bring it down?
No. I always mixed knowing. I'm always looking at my meters and listening for what it needs to be before it gets to them. But back in DAT days, the mastering guys would really love you if you left them 3 dB of headroom. So that's still to this day kind of my goal. I've never hit that, but there's usually at least a couple dB without limiting that I've done. There's usually a couple dB for them to, without limiting, even they could just turn it up before they did anything.
Right.
Of course, now that they're doing way more than that, but there was one record that I did a few years ago that the A&R guy hated it. And the producer was like, I don't understand, this is amazing. The A&R guy went around the producer and sent it to another guy who's now not even mixing anymore, he got out of the game. And the producer got it back and was like, dude, the A&R guy loves this, but it's so loud. Like there's no mix, it's just loud. And so the producer got the idea to send it to Brad, who was going to be mastering the record. He was like, you know what, I got an idea. So he sent my mix to Brad and told Brad, hey, I can't pay you for this, but Shane's about to lose the gig. Can you help us convince the A&R guy that it's just not mastered? And so it took Brad 3 tries to get it up to about 11 dB needed to match the other guy's thing, right? So the kind of A&R assistant on the record somehow convinced the A&R guy to blindly hear the 2, and he picked my mix, but didn't hire me because he had to admit he was wrong. So the record still went somewhere else, even though he blindly picked my mix after it was mastered.
Yeah, that's frustrating.
Yeah, and Brad didn't, sorry, I should say, I'm not patting myself on the back because you know I can't do that, right? But Brad didn't really do anything to it but make it louder, just so the A&R guy could understand that, well, all you gotta do is this. But it took him 3 tries to raise it almost 11 dB to match the other guy, whatever he had on his 2-bus, which was, crack, cocaine,
Well, I actually noticed that, funny you say that, this afternoon I just kind of briefly visited your website, and I was listening to some of the references, and like, not that it's like squash, but like they're really loud. Like they came like almost just like really present. I was like, oh
Right.
wow, these are like.
Well, that is all mastered stuff.
Yeah.
So that is all mastered stuff. But, which is a whole new conversation because now there's even a new reference unit, LUs. And
Yeah.
the whole idea of even changing what's expected for streaming, this loudness unit thing, which I'm like, yay, finally somebody gets it, but.
Well, I guess YouTube is now kind of doing their own leveling and mastering, which makes the levels going to them sort of irrelevant.
Well, but that's what led to the whole loudness unit thing, is when that stuff's happening, it's just, if you're, through the ceiling, once that,
They're gonna bring it down anyway.
well,
And if you're low, they're gonna bring it up, so it's like,
Exactly.
that's the point.
yeah,
It's all.
yeah. There was somebody else, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was gonna ask if there's a bunch of parallel stuff on the two bus.
Which was, that was a Richard Dodd.
Yeah, I didn't know where that came from.
That kind of goes back to him, but just, and I mean, honestly, it's not, that didn't have anything to do with Pro Tools, that was just, a parallel thing wasn't really happening with the guys that I assisted for, except for some old country guys, even, because I do most of my leveling through a mono speaker that's right in front of my face. And I got that trick from an old country guy at Quad Studios 25 years ago or whatever, and it kind of blew my mind. It's like, wait a minute, you make it sound really shitty, and then when you go to the good speakers, it sounds really good. Anyway, sorry. The parallel thing was some of those old country guys did that too. Like, working with rock guys, you're just squishing the piss out of almost everything. And these country guys were like, well, you can, but listen what happens when you put that up underneath when you didn't do it. So I do keep 3 stereo pairs of things that are doing really radical things that you would never do, that are then blended up underneath. Kind of low, but blended up underneath the stuff that is not getting that, and then all of that is going to the 2-bus treatment. So.
Would you say it's important to have like a hobby or other projects?
Oh God, yes.
Alongside?
Yeah, I like to mow. You're laughing, I'm totally serious. Seriously. Okay, you guys, how many of you guys make music for a living all the time? When do you ever finish anything in a day? When I mow on Sunday during mowing season, I look over my shoulder and that grass looks good. And nobody tweets, texts, or calls to tell me what to do differently the next time I mow. It is the most gratifying part of my year is getting to mow my lawn. And I was also raised in a trailer in Indiana, so it's kind of important for me to own a tiny little plot of land that I get to take care of. But more important than that is that it's mine, it's done in a day, and nobody tells me to change it. And every once in a while, it even gets complimented. So, I brew beer. I now occasionally distill whiskey or mezcal. Andy had some of that the other day. But I do like to distill. It came out of the brewing thing. I read. But yeah, I don't listen to a lot of music, sadly. But yeah, it's really important, I think. And you know what? But that happened over time. I will say in the beginning, as a young, eager guy, it was all that all the time. And I think that that's almost as important as aging into knowing that you need to step away from it a little bit. But yeah, hobbies are good.
Well, I know we could probably keep you here tonight with questions and asking things, but we're at 9:30, which is where we said we'd stop. I want to
Oh, wow.
that for you. You've got Naz and Stacy to go home to.
Yeah.
So if everybody could give the man a round of applause.
Thanks for spending some time with us here on YouTube. If you'd like to take us with you, search for Music City Listeners on your favorite podcasting platform.